Welcome back to the Beyond the Commit pod. This is part 2 of my conversation with Jared Green, ex-Microsoft, ex-LinkedIn, now the founder at Altar. Part 1 was about how you actually measure developers' productivity, and part 2 is about what happens when AI hits the org chart. We talk about maintenance gap, where most of the engineers' time goes to keeping software alive, and also why Claude Code beat Cursor, why Copilot underperformed at LinkedIn, even with the full enterprise rollout, and finally, why Jared thinks right now is the worst possible time to be sitting inside a big tech. Let's get into it.
The most dangerous trap as a leader is to fall into I can just tell everyone what to do and they'll do it, because it's just not reality. It's like humans can always make different decisions. They can always choose, and they can find reasons not to do stuff if they don't want to do it.
Yeah.
And that is the state of the industry. There are people who are living and breathing in the 10%, pointing out legitimate cases where everything falls down, but ignoring the fact that it might work 80% of the time. And that 80% is a huge shift in how we operate.
Software was, for many businesses, prohibitively expensive. You couldn't build anything custom. You had to go towards SaaS solutions. And with such solutions, things aren't easy either. A lot of them are, you pay for so many services, they are not custom for your needs. So I definitely feel like there is a new paradigm that is shaping up today.
There's people who are really worried about their jobs. They're worried about will I be displaced? I have a whole thought that's what in my experience is, it's going to be the opposite. We're seeing an explosion of software engineering. We're seeing this explosion of new software. There's a ton of new work.
I think this might be one of the best, if not the best, recommendation to try out the startup world.
The real pain isn't building software, it's maintaining it. It's keeping it up to date. It's making it scale. It's making sure that people don't forget that once you build the software, it's an ongoing cost you have to maintain.
I think that it's useful to sort of repeat that, because I heard that even recently from one of my colleagues, and what he said is look, if I have something to do that I deeply disagreed with, and I could give you a lot of different reasons that would be really true reasons, it would be very difficult for you to figure out whether they are stopping me or not, why I cannot do it. And I will give you some reasons that there are some operational difficulties, some other important aspects, and I can do it in such a way that you will tell me, okay, yeah, you gotta do those things first because they are more important. So if it seems again it's something that is, people keep forgetting about, that in the organization, it seems like you can say as a CTO or as a VP of engineering, you can, create a mandate and say people are gonna do it, but it is very easy, especially in larger organizations, to find some excuses, which would be very difficult, to figure out whether they are really true or not.
I mean, this is the biggest big principle in management that I learned early on, is that just because you're someone's boss doesn't mean you really can tell them what to do. I think people think that. I remember, people, were wanting to be managers early on in the career, and they're this idea, well, if I become the lead, I can tell people what to do. I was like, let me tell you how it works. You're constantly convincing people why it's the right thing to do and why it's in their best interest. There's this whole part of sales or influence strategies that you have to master as a leader, that you have to get people on board, right? And I think the most dangerous trap as a leader is to fall into I can just tell everyone what to do and they'll do it, because it's just not reality. It's humans can always make different decisions. They can always choose, and they can find reasons not to do stuff if they don't want to do it. So part of you is convincing people this is in your interest to do it, because not only do you want to do it because it's a good thing, but the reality is you go faster if you can get people to agree and understand, and they may even think of solutions that you didn't think of to these problems.
Yeah.
But if you create this why should I do it? I told you to do it. you create this weird like friction and resistance that people are fighting now versus like if people see the benefits and they want to do it, they will overcome the hurdles that they would have done. So, but I think
Yeah.
this is like a pattern that leaders fall into where they just sort of get this idea that like, well, we're paying you, so you should do what I tell you. And like, yeah, that's true, but
Yeah. Sort
maybe
of.
not.
Yeah.
Like people are independent, they can do what they want. And like, you have to acknowledge that that's, like part of being a leader is being more multifaceted and understanding humans and how to actually influence them to like, act in their best interest as well. Right. So there's a lot of influence strategy that goes into this kind of stuff. I think it's important. And I think if you start thinking of it more as like I'm selling an idea to people, I'm selling, and I'm really trying to validate it's the right approach, not just like thou shalt do it. I think you create a better environment for people to really push back, for you to learn, to actually get feedback and really evolve your approach to be the right one.
Hmm.
And so you know, I think it's a common problem though.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So we mentioned also these the part about gathering service as part of the in addition to the metrics. So you wanted also to have some sort of the feedback more which is more subjective.
Mhm.
Switching gears to the field of AI and various AI tooling and things like that. What is the impact of Gen AI tooling on developers' happiness? Is there an impact?
I mean, so what I saw, in general, is sort of like there've been sort of two camps that have sort of arisen in, across multiple types of engineering types. There's people who like use the technologies and truly seen something magical,
Mm-hmm.
like, who've seen like, hey, if I do this, like, I have this new experience. I can focus on a different class of problems. And then there's a like sort of the antithesis to it, where just people like they used it and they had a really poor experience. The AI generated a bunch of garbage. They didn't, and they've sworn off it completely. And you see people sort of in these two camps right now. And it's sort of like people who are like, the AI will never be able to do what I do.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like, oh, you know what? The AI is the new programming language. Prompting is the new programming language. It's almost like there's like these sort of extremes that you see sort of diametrically opposed. And I think there's a lot of gray in the middle of people who are like, yeah, I've used it for this. And I think a lot of it has to do with like in the early days, like, a lot of it looked like a parlor trick. Like if you looked at the early days of some of these AI generated stuff, the examples, the approaches were very contrived, controlled. And so people
Yeah.
would go, yeah, that's never going to work for scale.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people are driven by that sort of mindset. It's a parlor trick. I also think the modalities and the way that we, rolled out AI to people were wrong. Like I think the lot, like you can see the adoption of things like Claude Code and Cursor and how they integrate into engineers' experience was also very important. I think there's sort of an aspect of that too. But at the heart, there's sort of this core argument, which is, does this generate good stuff or is this just garbage? Right. And I think the answer is maybe more towards the answer. It's kind of magical.
Mm-hmm.
And think, but people are quick to point to like, I remember sitting with a very seasoned principal engineer who worked for me, super smart guy. Um, And every time I brought up AI with him, he was always pointing to the counter examples of why AI would never work for various problems.
Yeah.
And it's like a very stereotypical paradigm that I see. Right? I was like, well, dude, what if it works 80% of the time? Like,
Mm-hmm.
he would give me the, like, hey, here's the 10% case where it wouldn't work. And I'd say, yeah, but if it works for 80%, who gives a shit?
Yeah.
And that is the state of the industry. there are people who are living and breathing in the 10%, pointing out legitimate cases where everything falls down, but ignoring the fact that like it might work 80% of the time. And that 80% is a huge shift in how we operate, right? And I think the magic for people building, next generation dev tools is figuring out how you make the AI focus on the 80% stuff that's going to be magical
Hmm.
and avoid the 10% where it's just going to fall over, right? And really make sure that what you build is really adding to, not taking away from engineers, right? Like a lot of how we've approached, and look, this is an industry trend that's um, like we're so focused on code generation, which I think is interesting, but like not focused on like, scenarios that are pragmatically helping people. I'm constantly fascinated like why like we have, companies out showing like you can build a whole app in 5 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah, sure, great, but often those apps are like playthings or like toys that
Yeah.
really. But man, if I sit down and I'm trying to debug something these days, right? I'm not going through the logs by hand anymore,
Yeah.
right? I'm using like, but we're so focused on this one dimension of it when we talk about it. We're not really focused on these other things that it's such an additive that it's undeniable, right? And I think people just want to really, and there's emotion too. There's people who are really like worried about their jobs. They're worried about like, will I be displaced? I have a whole thought that it's what in my experience is it's going to be the opposite. We're seeing an explosion of software engineering. We're seeing this explosion of new software. Like there's a
So
ton of
more
new work.
toward Jevons paradox. It's gonna
Yeah,
be
I
the
mean,
industry gonna
it's
go.
like yeah, we're creating more and more software. I mean, we couldn't, and this is the part that I think a lot of engineers. And look, it's coupled with a bunch of other things that are happening in the industry at the same time that people are projecting into this. For a long time, engineering companies grew their R&D, their software departments without any sort of guardrails. Like why one company has 5,000 engineers and one company has 1,000, even though they're producing the same product.
Yeah.
Like nobody could articulate why they needed X or Y. And a lot of it, and many, CTOs were sort of didn't have to justify to their CFO why we need all these engineers. We need them, right? And so there's been this whole sort of other dimension that's going on. Of why do we need this many people? And then the advent of AI comes in and says, well, we have AI now, so we should be able to use less people, right? Layered into that conversation. I think there are actually two separate conversations happening at the same time that people are conflating, right? I think there is this world of like, yes, many companies got bloated and big and they weren't actually being efficient. That can also be true that AI can make us more efficient.
Hmm.
But like I think we're combining the two conversations, which is also causing all this angst for many engineers, which is like and then what I see is an explosion of software creation, like an
Hmm.
explosion of new software development, right? People who've never written software in their life now getting into software,
Hmm.
right? And building stuff for the first time. And I think we're going to experience a massive, like, if you go back, maybe 5, 6 years ago, it was hard to hire people. It was hard to find
Sure.
engineers. And we're just in this period where everyone's readjusting and understanding, we're right sizing their companies. That if we continue on this trend with this massive explosion of new software, you're going to see it become more and more people who have expertise in AI, people who know how to use these things effectively. You're going to see a desire to hire more people. So I think people are reacting to this other dimension, and it's also getting pulled into the sort of AI space. But at the root of it, there is stuff the AI stuff doesn't do well. It doesn't do well. It makes mistakes. It doesn't have taste. It doesn't have like it'll pick technologies that are not necessarily the best technologies. It doesn't necessarily have the experience or expertise. So these are real problems that
Hmm.
may or may not ever solve. There's also issues with the size of context windows on large code bases. There's a whole class of problems that I think are still to be solved. But at the same time, there are pragmatic advances we can make with the technology as it is that we're sort of not talking about. We're really
Mm-hmm.
focused on like sort of like this, I don't want to call it a fantasy, but this sort of like dream state where we basically have AI writing all the software, right? And I don't have to hire any engineers. And as part of that, we're missing, I think, a lot of things that are opportunities to dramatically accelerate things. Because, it's sort of like we're trying to do the Uber thing first versus really identifying, can AI be integrated into our CI/CD pipelines as an example to automatically
Mm-hmm.
fix pipeline bugs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why, like,
Why
why
not?
do I have, yeah, why doesn't GitHub Actions or GitLab or Bitbucket automatically have things that look at your pipeline, propose fixes, make PRs, and then just keep iterating till it fixes it, right? Um, those are things that are pretty pragmatically. In many cases, many pipeline fixes can be fixed pretty, strategically, and you can bound those things in a way that like limits what they can do, can create controls, and I think that part is being overlooked
Mm-hmm.
because the big interest is this sort of like don't hire an engineering team, have 1,000 AIs working for you, right? Versus like these are the real pain points for engineers. The real pain isn't um, building software, it's maintaining it. It's
Right.
keeping it up to date. It's making it scale. It's making sure that like like people don't forget that once you build the software, it's an ongoing cost you have to maintain. And like the adage we used to have is we would look at the team like 90% of the engineers' time wasn't spent on building new software. It was spent on keeping the old software working.
Yeah.
And that's the part that I see we're not focused on. We're spending a ton of time on a whole set of dimensions that I think are really cool, and there's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with it. But I think if most engineers looked at these tools as adding to their experience, making the toil and the pain points that they have in their day-to-day life and really applying it towards that, I think they realize that, man, I can go so much faster. I don't have to spend my time on the crap work anymore. I can spend
Mm-hmm.
my time on the things I really enjoy. I think part of it's also a marketing issue. Like I think we're marketing towards like, hey, this will do all your work, and it's like it's really not true, right? In like at least the current state, right?
Yeah. It does change the dynamics, though. I mean, like, it's difficult, as you say. You mentioned that earlier that it's difficult to assess the productivity boost, but it certainly seems so. I think, like, my impression was like last year that we were in such a already in the stage where we are seeing maybe not diminishing returns, but maybe more of evolution rather than revolution. And then by the end of the year, when Opus 4.5 became popular, I think I sort of again started to see almost a revolution because it seems to be significantly better,
Hmm.
with more and more complex things, and it seems so that the code creation itself became cheaper, and I'm wondering, and this is sort of resonating with me. What you said resonates with me because I was wondering if the code generation and building the solution gets cheaper and cheaper, how does it change the dynamics in the process of building the entire software? So for me, like I was wondering, won't we stumble upon a bottleneck very soon that the bottleneck would be like there are not enough features or product advancement that are specified to
Mm.
sufficient stage that really development teams could pick up and start working on because the bottleneck
Well,
might start to be somewhere else.
let's take a more like provocative sort of stance. It's like, what is the
Please. Yeah.
need for a product organization and an engineering organization in a world where we have AI tools? Like if you extrapolate over time, right now,
Yeah.
like many companies are separated. The product organization defines the what, and the engineering teams the
Yeah.
how. But much of the how now can be delegated to many of these tools to some degree, right? Of course, there's more and more needs for senior engineers who can guide the AI correctly. But like is the organizational structure we have in many companies the right one? If you think
Mm-hmm.
about it, think about this. Like we designed these structures as sort of checks and balances, right? We had product to sort of come up with ideas, and then we had engineering bounding it with what we could accomplish, right? But in a world where the cost, of producing features drops to zero or approaches zero at some
Mm-hmm.
point, right? You have to think about how you combine product and engineering in some meaningful way. You have to think about like, is is every engineer now need to be more product minded and less engineering minded,
Mm-hmm.
right? And or what's the redistribution of checks and balances? Because that old checks and balances don't make a lot of sense. And you can already see, like, if in the industry, you see a lot of friction right now between people who are vibe coding stuff, and then they're like, oh, well, this is going to take 5 years to build, and they're using the old approaches. And so I think there's just sort of a reckoning first on what are these new org structures given this sort of disruptive technology. Like, and I don't think companies have figured that out. I
Yeah.
think that those lines, are going to be sort of, have to be reevaluated, right?
Yeah.
And some places, if I was, the line between product and engineering needs to be rethought because
Mm-hmm.
it's not as definite now. Like, you don't need someone who's going to sit there and figure out the like schedule for the how for 6 months, right? You need someone who's going to like, okay, how are we going to get this to customer? And you need engineering to take much more of a product mindset than they ever did before. At the same time, I think there's a lot of, I mean, in some ways, we're also far from that because we've, what I see is a lot of companies are still not embracing AI. Like, it's interesting you say like that you see the speed up. What I see is that startups, small companies,
Mm-hmm.
massive, massive difference. People are like
Sure.
leaning in, and they have the ability to switch and pivot to new AI tools overnight, try new things. The larger the company, the less productivity gain I see. And I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
side effect of like the realities of like the larger the code base, the less the context windows can't accommodate that. They can't really understand the code base at scale. And so that's a real problem that I think is existing where I think people who are smaller and nimbler, right now can actually move in a way that you can't if your code base is huge. And you could see like, look, what does that mean, right, over the long term? No, there's chances the technologies shift, the models get better, they get bigger, they're able to handle large contexts. Maybe the inference technologies get substantially better so that they don't need as much context, or they're able to figure out things more dynamically. There's also still like there's a lot of unknowns in the AI space too. I mean, let's just look at MCP. And first it was like putting MCP on everything, and now realizing that eats up context windows. So the idea is like, let's
Mm-hmm.
not use MCPs, let's use
Yeah.
skills or something else. And so I think there's still a lot of like the technology is still in many ways in its infancy, and it has implications for how people organize and structure. And I think it's hard to look at the big players and the big tech companies and really draw any conclusions because I don't see the productivity gains from them happening the way that they pontificate them happening. I just don't see it. And I think, but I do see it from smaller startups who are popping up, going to, 10 million in ARR in a few months. And so the question is like, how is that going to play out? Like, is it these large companies are going to restructure themselves, rethink how their code base work to be more AI friendly? There's a lot to figure out there. And I don't know, in some ways, it's not an AI problem, it's a how do we apply it problem, right? Because the startups can apply it right now without having to change their fundamental structure, and they can evolve their company around that AI technology, right? When you're an incumbent player, it's very hard to do that, right? So I think there's a lot of questions sort of in that space of like, what is it, what does an AI first company look like?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you have to do to operate that? Like, does it mean you get rid of your engineering org and have a combined product and engineering org? Does it mean, and like that may not be the reality, but that may be, a thought that people start to have. At there's all these questions in the space that I think are really difficult for people to kind of wrestle with because they're fundamental changes to how we've operated for 30 years.
Yeah.
And so I think there's still a lot of experimentation, and there still hasn't been, at least from my perspective, a massive success with AI development at a large company. I haven't
Hmm.
seen that. Anecdotally, you'll hear stories about that, but like it's not evident that that's happening. I think there are a couple cases you could point to in startups that have appeared out of
Sure.
nowhere that that's happened. And so I think the question is like, what are driving those two, different ecosystems? What are the lessons the big companies are going to pull from them, and vice versa? Or do the technologies change yet again with a rate of pace that changes the whole set of rules and restrictions, right? And a lot of it right now, it's being set by the fundamental limits of these technologies, right? So that's what's hard to figure out, right?
Hmm. But that has to be a part of the equation, and the other part of the equation, like in my mind, has to be like it would seem to me. I'm not sure that it has to be, but it seems to me that the other part is that in larger organization, the larger the organization is, the less development every engineer do, right? So it's like for the startup, they might be spending 12 hours a day on coding or maybe 10 hours a day. And even in
Mhm.
the middle-sized organization, it's going to be like we have this running joke in our company that juniors tend to be faster than seniors because for juniors you give them the task and they spend on it maybe 2 days, and for senior you give it the task, maybe they would do it in 1 day, but they have to attend one of these meetings, meet with the stakeholders, do something else, do things, and they will finish it in 3 days because they are not only building code, they are doing also something else. And I think that as the company grows, part of the factor has to be that the development and creating code is only a smaller and smaller fraction of the overall process. And we are, I think, scratching the surface when it comes to, that's my impression, when it comes to, harvesting any
Yeah.
gains from the AI in those processes in general.
Well, I think, but that's the problem, right? What you just said is exactly the thing I'm pining on is that nobody's really going after the things that
Yeah.
are really affecting productivity at big companies. Like what I see is that like the tools and the things that are being created right now really address specific market segment, right? And they really are about creators. But like that's not the reality after you get to a certain size. Like you do even like, once you're a certain size, you're not spending a big chunk of your time on like creation. You're spending your time on like maintenance and management and really doing a lot of these tasks. Like, you know, I mean, like, I can give you a bunch of features that we could talk about that would be great, right? Imagine some AI listens to all my, messages, notices the site is offline or an issue, automatically generates a PR for an engineer review. Where is that?
Hmm.
Where is that technology, right? Like, where are these things that really fundamentally everyone experiences,
Yeah.
right? And like, we don't have that set of technologies. It's like, I could draw the parallel between the way Cursor really made AI accessible for creators was how they integrated AI into the experience, right? And like fundamentally, that's a gap right now in many of the scenarios that what I would consider what engineering happens at scale, right? Is that there isn't this integration into the overall experience. There isn't thinking about like how do you operate a large scale project.
So the interesting also part that you mentioned earlier was related to you mentioned that you were rolling out Copilot at LinkedIn as one of the, very early when it wasn't very popular, and you did a company-wide rollout. And what you also mentioned is that it wasn't very successful in terms of that adoption, where it wasn't that great. So I was
Yeah,
wondering
we
about why it might have been the case, and maybe we could draw some lessons from that to CTOs or the technology leaders who are rolling out AI tools in their organizations.
yeah, I think we rolled out we were very early on we had early access to Copilot. We were probably, I think we were the first enterprise that fully like had everyone had Copilot seats. And I think there's two parts to it. Um, there was this aspect of like, you know, I think the early implementations of Copilot, it was really just sort of
Code
a
completion.
complete on steroids. Yeah. And I think that, we saw like very low sort of use cases of it, right? And we would spend a lot of time with the GitHub folks trying to figure out like what metrics do we have on it, where is it going? And I think I also felt like it wasn't. There was a lot of opinions too on things like it's not trained on our own code base, so it couldn't understand how to do things. So the suggestions it gave people weren't necessarily better. And I think when you see things like how Cursor augmented that in
Hmm.
their own technology and what they did, it was a huge leap in sort of where we were. So I think the experience was part of it, but I think also it didn't meet people where they're at. Like you would use it, but it didn't feel like it was this like you had to engage it and use it in a way that I think people weren't really ready for. And
Hmm.
that's part of it. But I also think when I reflect on it, like we did another feature that was basically fixed builds automatically. And that got like with our own AI engine and similar technologies, but like that had almost like universal adoption overnight.
Hmm.
We didn't have to like push people. And I think it's a question, and I use the cursor analogy. It's like if you meet people where they're at, like if you take some workload off them, the more you have to make people learn a new technology or learn how to approach it. And I think, I would argue that like cursor opened people's eyes to what you could do with it, and Claude Code really, I think, met people, many developers, much more where they were at.
Yeah.
But and I think that's a dimension of it. But I also think there's this dimension of like a lot of these AIs you have to engage with, and to draw parallels from other industries. Like I had done a bunch of work with some folks on sort of measuring AI in different industries, right? And what's fascinating is like sales, marketing. They have, dude, the stuff you can do with ChatGPT to do sales and marketing stuff is amazing.
Yeah.
But you go
Especially
talk
with
to
deep
these,
search and things like that is
yeah.
amazing.
But you go talk to sales and marketing groups, and most of the employees are not using these tools,
Huh.
right? And so here's the question of why, right? Well, some of it's fear, but it's also having to learn how to do it.
Sure.
And I think part of it is like I think some of the modalities that we have right now for AI is wrong. We've consistently created chatbots.
Yeah.
Like everything is a chatbot. Let's put a chat
Yeah.
window here. Let's put a chat window here. And the reality is, I think for a lot of we had this whole thought about AI being much more of a like a person you add to your team. That
Hmm.
honestly, and I think the more I've thought about that, there's parts of that that are true, but I think there's this aspect of how do you integrate it in a way that it feels natural. Like it has to feel like it isn't some extra task for you to go do, right? Because you'll get some people with the technology, because people who will early adopters will engage,
Sure.
use it, and see the value and do a bunch of work. But for the masses, it has to feel like it doesn't have to be work to adopt. It has to just naturally come along. And I think the more I
Hmm.
think about like, a good example that I think about a lot is like, you know, why do I have to engage, you know, Gemini and Google and Gmail to write me an email? Like, why doesn't it just read
Yeah.
my email? And then they're saying they're going to do this now, right? But like, think of the
Superhuman is
difference.
doing sort of it. Like when you
Yeah,
have
but that's
superhuman.
exactly it, right?
Yeah.
Think of the difference between superhuman and what Google came out and said they're going to do, and like, okay, I'm going to copy and paste my email to ChatGPT, then tell it
Yeah.
all this stuff, or I'm going to do something and it doesn't seem to give me a really good response.
Yeah.
But it's really the integration. It's the modality. It's how you bring people on board. Because first of all, a lot of people hear AI and they think threat. Right now, there's a whole bunch of like, yeah, I don't want to do that. I'm threatened by it. It's also new. Like
Hmm.
the early adopters of technologies are people who are freaks. Like they're not normal people. People who embrace these technologies early on, they're they're the in some ways they're the outliers, not the sort of
Yeah.
core people, and they can those people were seeing the value. And like for me, I'm using tons of different AIs, all different experiments, but I'm an anomaly, right? Compared to other people, I'm a freak compared to most people, right? Because most people are like, oh, I just have this nice workflow, I do it this way. So you have to capture that experience in a way that doesn't feel threatening, or sort of like, change management's a real thing. If
Hmm.
it just started, like if you went into your Gmail and it just said, hey, you got this email, here's a draft response that I could send for you, right? And it, used all the context it has from the previous emails from the person, or documents, right? You'd be like, hey, that's pretty cool, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't delete it. But that's what I mean, is modalities have to be different. And I think engineering is no different in this case. There's people who've adopted some of these tools, see the power. They're deep in the like the in sort of embracing it. And then there's a whole other set of folks that we need to change the modality so that it's not like a change how they work, it's adding to, right? And I think that's part of it, is like, like the example I gave around, like, detecting a site issue and then automatically proposing a fix. Like, that just seems like awesome. Like, hey, instead of me getting a call that the site's down and I need to get on a Zoom call or deal with some issue, like literally I get, hey, the site's down, here's a potential fix. Would you like me to push it? Totally
Hmm.
different experience than, you getting hey, here's some message. Here's a bunch of things you got to go look at now. Like, we have to create that ecosystem for people to bring them forward. And that's where I think the future is for a lot of this stuff, is like people starting to reevaluate how applications are built, how software is built, in a way that's AI first, not like, hey, I'm going to cut and paste what I have into some AI,
Yeah.
then do some work, then cut and paste it back into this other app. Like, our apps are still not in this good integrated experience. And also thinking about, like, how do you make the AI, act like people? Like, you know, we have all these like interview things that listen to our interviews, right? Why doesn't it automatically integrate with, your task thing and create tasks for you automatically? And sure, you can go to N8N and you can build all this and you can add all
Hmm.
this stuff and make it all happen. But the amount of work it takes right now for someone to go make that a reality is very, very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Not even mentioning the skills. I mean, it's easier than it was, but it's still work, and you need to be, sort of aware how to do it. But it is
And you have to be an
interesting
expert.
because, yeah, you have to be an expert. Sure. I mean, like, it's interesting what you say, because I sort of see this integration, because what you say, like, I really does. The important factor of the technology is it's got to be transparent in a way, integrated in
Mhm.
your workflow. It can't be the additional thing to do, the separate thing to do. It got to be streamlined. That's one of the key aspects of it to be successful. But then when I think about CodeRabbit, it seems to me sort of streamlined. It meets you at where you are at the GitHub repository on your pull request review. But on the other hand, you have, for instance, Claude Code, which is like, I do get it that there are some developers who like to code in terminal, but let's be honest, that's the minority. People got converted. A lot of people got converted from the IDEs, and then they got convinced to, well, we'll go back to console, to the CLI, as we did like maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, because the tool is so powerful.
Yeah. So on the Claude Code, the freaks that use terminal, I'd consider myself one. I think it's interesting. It's interesting you say that, because my perspective is that using Claude Code was more natural than using Cursor. Like, because, and here's the difference that maybe I picked up on it. The thing I can do with Claude Code that wasn't easy to do with Cursor, you know, was Claude Code can go and run a bunch of commands in my Kubernetes cluster. It can make a
Yeah.
bunch of changes. It can inspect things. Of course, you can do some of that with Cursor now, but like, I think the real thing is that once it had access to the console, it was no longer bound to the IDE. And
Hmm.
because it was in the console, it could take actions that no longer were possible in previous experiences. And when you talk about like when I think about as an engineer, there's a big portion of time I look at code, but a whole bunch of my time is spent like, querying things, setting up clusters, running commands to do things on a deployment, pulling logs, um, inspect, like, and the thing that Claude did that I thought was powerful was they really unbounded these AIs, sort of gave it the ability to talk to everything. And yeah, you can add MCPs to do a lot of this stuff now, but because of the richness of the command line, it could reach out and touch everything.
Right.
And it's the integration though that really made it interesting. Like if it was just an AI that would generate a bunch of code for you, right? It's the fact that it actually can manage your pull requests. It could do the Git check-ins.
Yeah.
You don't have to know 60 different Git commands to figure out how to do a proper rebase. Or like, man, people are talking about doing work trees now. Like so few
Yeah.
engineers knew what even a work tree was 3 years ago. Like, but now I
No one
see,
used that.
yeah, but now everyone's like, oh, I got my agents working in work trees and Claude Code, right? And so I think you have to think about it. Why it's had success is because it enabled the AI to act in a way that no
Hmm.
one else had demonstrated before. And once that was shown, right, it really, it really opened people's worlds. And I think, obviously Cursor has embraced that, but that was the gap, right? It's not just editing your code and showing you a diff or doing autocomplete. It's
Yeah.
taking action for you.
Yeah.
And that's the part that's magical for a lot of people. The magical part, like, man, setting up a GCP cluster, and going through all that and setting up permissions, setting up Vault, all these things, they're incredibly laborious tasks that, I cannot do in an editor. I need to have a command line tool to do it, or I can do it in the web. And I think, you see, a lot of people using like Comet and some of these new AI infused browsers because there's a lot of web apps.
Hmm.
And it's so much easier to use one of these web apps than one of these AI browsers because you can be like, how do I do this? Can you do this for me? Can you change this? Right. So there's this dimension of like giving the AI access to things that's really important. But I also think it sort of rhymes with my theme, which is like, hey, the more you make it natural for you to kind of
Hmm.
do the things, like to do these tasks, the more it just makes it easier for people. And so like, you know, if you have to be an expert in all these different command lines to do some of these things, now you don't, you know,
Hmm.
and you can use these tools. And that's why I think things like Warp and Claude Code were really, I mean, Warp in some ways was ahead of Claude Code. And I thought they were really doing some cool stuff because it was like, hey, I can set up my Git enlistments properly in a few minutes where, and would do it with a care that I would never have done for myself. Right. So those are things that I think are really powerful that I think people are not seeing when they think about it. Like, because it's not about the editor. I think that's the
Yeah.
thing. It's like, it's the editor is like a commodity. Like the problem is people are so emotional about editors, they become like religious conversations that I think that's what's dominated the talk. But it's about the integration. It's all about the integration. It's about how you integrate the AI into your experience that allows you to amplify yourself, right?
Right.
And I think what they've done is give it the ability to reach out. I'm saying there's a whole other dimension of like pull.
Hmm.
Like where do you have these AIs pulling from things? Like, it knows all this stuff. Why can't it be, searching my Grafana logs on the fly, looking for errors, making suggestions, opening bugs? And the CodeRabbit's a good example of where they're doing this too. They've basically built it so it pulls, it looks for it, and then it takes action. And I think that's a lot of the next generation of these dev tools that have to come out.
Hmm.
Um, and it's pretty cool though, man. I don't know. I
It
really,
is.
yeah, it's definitely a cool time to be alive. Like I've never had more joy in writing code than I have in the last year.
Yeah. Many people say that. And it's apart from that, so that's the other interesting question, at least for me, that I have. But before we go into that, it also feels to me like we had few years that weren't that exciting in software technology. And I'm thinking about, 20, I mean, there were exciting, however whatever it means, events in the world. That for sure. We had a lot of different things. But in terms of software technology, my impression was that it was almost boring by the beginning of 2020, something like that. And it became for me exciting again. I mean, for me, it was exciting in 2010. There was all those new things. There was Kubernetes, Docker started to appear, people started using cloud, things like that. And then it sort of for me stagnated. And then I again these days found this joy of things that are happening. Every few months there is something new that changes things.
Interesting. I mean, I would say, I mean, I definitely feel there was a lot of, maybe the problem is the complexity had reached, with all the cloud stuff, I mean, Kubernetes, Terraform, the complexity of managing a software project had reached its pinnacle probably in 2020, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the ability for a single person to understand a software installation is very challenging.
Yeah.
And I think we were starting to pick up on technologies and containerization to minimize, and this is why I think we went to a lot of microservices and stuff, because it was about reducing cognitive load,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because monoliths get, the bigger a piece of software is, the harder it is for you to keep everything in your head. And I think what you may be tapping into, at least from my perspective, is as the complexity of the technology got higher and higher, the excitement, the ability to feel like you could do something got lower and lower.
Oh,
And I think
definitely.
the AI, what it's done is it's reduced the complexity for a lot of people because you don't have to be a
Yeah.
domain expert
And
and say,
entry
well,
barrier.
yeah, it's just reduced a bunch of those barriers that like, we had sort of created a whole new set of like you only the wizards of secret management can work on the vault system at our company, right? And so having that unbounded, I think, has reinvigorated a lot of people who were do it themselves. Even simple things like, there were lots of camps that were like very tied to their technology, would never try something else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the AI stuff has in some ways unbounded people to try all sorts of new stuff. I think that's the part that's exciting. Like it really has equalized people. And I think people at the same time, people are starting to say, oh, expertise isn't valuable anymore. And I think it's the opposite. It's like the people who've spent time with these systems, the same concepts apply. And I think it's really important to remember that that the more you engage with these AI technologies, the more expertise you garner and the more knowledge you sort of, and you're able to think about it conceptually. Like the details, you don't have to know the esoteric aspects of a particular language now. You need to understand conceptually how things fit together. And I actually think that's a better place. I think we're going to end up with better software because people are going to start thinking at like a level higher than they used to
Mm-hmm.
think. Right now, like because you couldn't spend your time. Most people can't keep in their head, you know, both the complexity of a large architecture and a particular piece of code. If
Right.
we assume that the AI will be good at actually writing, good high quality code, people are going to spend their time thinking about how things fit together, what's the design, what's the architecture. And that was always the exciting part. That was
Yeah.
always the fun part, right? It was always we're on a whiteboard drawing blocks of how things are going to integrate, how they're going to work together. That part, I think, is becoming more and more the common work now,
Mm-hmm.
and the drudgery is disappearing. And I think, it's kind of a bright new world. And I can't tell you, like I've shared there's a bunch of people who are out of the industry now who are like people who worked with or who were, let retired, they were, old school, low level engineers. And I introduced a couple of them to AI, and I was like, hey, you should try this out. I gave them little tasks. And they're like, man, it takes all the shit work out
Yeah.
that I used to do, and I can accomplish things in like a day. And like the joy you can see people feeling from using these technologies is real, right? And I
Yeah.
think to me, anytime there's joy and excitement that you can see in a user space, like that's going to translate into lots and lots of new stuff, lots and
Mm-hmm.
lots of amazing new technologies, businesses, companies. And so I feel like we've got to get through this adjustment period. But once we're there, I really feel like this is a bright new world for lots of software engineers to leverage their skills to really do some things that are amazing.
That sounds very optimistic because obviously there are at least two different camps about we are gonna end up in the flood of AI slop from one hand, and the other people saying like and then AI slop not necessarily in the context of social media, but also
You
in the
know,
context of code base. But the your take is a significant is the on the optimistic part, and I mean, we may stop that this thread on this optimistic note. And one last thing that I wanted to ask you is your current initiative out there, and you've spending all those years in corporate world, moving now to the startup world, which is this is on its own, by the way, interesting. But before we get into that, if we get into that, maybe you could tell us something. Maybe you could shed some light on the challenges that you
yeah,
want to tackle. Like, what's the
yeah,
problem that you want to solve?
yeah. I mean, I think there's a bunch of things that I kind of noticed. So, I left LinkedIn and, I really intended to work in the AI space. I saw a lot of like paradigm shifts happening, and I really
Mm-hmm.
saw this aspect around maintenance being a real problem and no one really going after it. And originally I thought, oh, every tech company is going to build maintenance AI
Mm-hmm.
software. None have done it really that I think is reasonably well yet. So that's part of it. But this other aspect that I really realized, and I advise a bunch of startups, and I've been sitting with a lot of companies, both technical and non-technical founders. And what I realized is that there's a lot of expertise that like I've learned from running large scale systems that people just don't build their engineering system for a company in a way that's scalable. And a lot of times, like it's like super simple things, like from enabling Git hooks to prevent people from injecting secrets or all sorts of stuff. There's this whole notion of an SDLC, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and what you see is that like startups historically they would use the excuse of we don't have engineering resources to do all
Right.
this sort of like structural work. And a lot of it I've been thinking is like, this is like 5 minutes with an AI to add some of these things nowadays. Why aren't you doing it? And so like you sit down and you say like a lot of times it's like, yeah, I know I should do that, but I don't want to spend the time on it. So a lot of what we're doing with Otter is first trying to understand if we can look across the entire space of software, understand are people really setting themselves up to be a well-maintained product. But we've also really looked at like maintenance at scale, and I had thought things like Dependabot solved
Mm-hmm.
maintenance like holistically. And then I've talked to a bunch of customers and realized that not many people are actually using it to do major revisions. And it's like, man, in this world of AI, these should be solved problems at this point. So
Right.
we're really trying to go after this, like, how do we help people really, in some ways, have a virtual CTO that can sit with them, advise them to how to build their company to scale, but also set them up to have very minimal maintenance costs of software. And so our first set of tasks is really building out software that really a platform that maintains open source or any repo that's in the open for people and really eliminate all this burden of like, hey, and part of it's setting it up so that it can be maintained, right? Because if you don't have a CI/CD pipeline, which is shocking, by the way, but there's tons of
Hmm.
open source projects that don't have a build file in it. They don't have,
Sure.
and even then, they're not curating the best practices. For example, like Python, there's like 2.8 million GitHub repos still using requirements.txt and not
Right.
using UV. And it's just like you go, some of them are highly used things. And I go, well, this is a whole space for people to really, set people up to minimize their costs and really get value and not spend their time on all these maintenance or what they would call infra tasks. So we're
Mm-hmm.
really focused on how do we build a platform that reduces maintenance costs dramatically and really makes it so they can focus on building software. And really leads into the themes I was talking about earlier around like how do we really, look for those things proactively, make the AI take care of it so you don't have to actually think about these things, right? In a way where there's still some human in the loop to make decisions and calls, but like you don't need your engineer spending 5 days trying to figure out how to, you know, resolve a one-off security issue, all these like small maintenance tasks that are popping, right? How do you redeploy? These are all things that if you set up correctly can be just well maintained. And a lot of it comes from like, having been at Microsoft and LinkedIn for a long time, you get used to you walk in the door and there's all these systems that do all these things for you. And
Yeah.
you do a startup and there's none of that. You have to build it all yourself, right? And I was like, well, we could just create that for people automatically for them to start, right? And then, help them maintain their software at scale. So that's what we're doing. And that's sort of the idea. And we're pretty far along in, our platform, but it's still early days in many ways. And, we're looking for like, to really sort of help people like really build great companies and
Hmm.
really avoid this sort of like maintenance trap that we're talking about where 90% of your time is spent just keeping the software up to date. We want to work with companies that are going to get to a place where they can spend all their engineering resources on building
Hmm.
and not worry about like and also really help people who are non-technical, who are really thinking about doing startups, right? Really feel confident that they're building the right engineering system to actually maintain the software at scale.
Hmm. That's a great target audience. I was thinking that when we mentioned this, we were talking around this Jevons paradox. Software was, for many businesses, prohibitively expensive. You couldn't build anything custom. You had to go towards SaaS solutions, and with such solutions, things aren't easy either. Like a lot of them are you pay for so many services, they are not custom for your needs. So I definitely feel like there is a new paradigm that is shaping up today. How do you provide sort of the custom, in a way, custom software, or at least software that could be flexible enough to serve the needs of those companies that couldn't afford the custom software in the past?
That's a great analogy. I've actually used the analogy of every engineering system out there is a bespoke suit that's custom tailored to the company. And what we're looking to do is build the off the rack suits for people that they can just buy, put on, and they mostly are fit. They might need to be tailored a little bit, but there's a generally set of like, hey, these are not bad. These will work, right? And I
Yeah,
think they're for the longest time, like if you really want to do this, you end up building very custom integrated solutions. But in this new world, it's not hard to like glue these things together, understand what they're trying to accomplish, and really create that, like really commoditize that bespoke nature, right? And that's the thing that I think you're hitting on, which is super true. It's like, even when you get out of the software element, like you have to glue together 16 different SaaS products to run a company.
yeah,
Like it really is about like how do you glue these things together to
yeah.
work, right? And people are, and it where it hits the software part of the company is that your maintenance costs go up because you like did you
Sure.
pick up this thing to do this and did you glue this to here? Do you have this? And like, some ways it's not that hard. It's just not a priority, right? And wouldn't you rather pay someone, you know, a fixed amount of money to know that it's going to be actually done in a way that you can scale, right? And that's what that's the total mindset we're in.
Hmm. Last question. So many years, big organizations, tens or hundreds of reports. How does it feel to work at a startup right now?
Um, you know, uh, I love it because I'm unbounded. Like there's a conformity. You end up when you work at these companies, you end up not necessarily having choice on tools, technologies. You're very limited on what you can pick. Like you have some degree of freedom, but you don't like even in the roles I was in, I could decide for a lot of the company what we
Mm,
used. But even there, you end up with like limitations on what technologies you can use. So there's this aspect of exploration and trying different tech stacks and mixing and matching that I really kind of leaned into. So like, and I'm learning a ton. So like for me, there's this joy of that. Um, Things that I've been like are sort of things I knew, but they're different. Is like, at these big companies, you have like whole divisions that handle
mm,
aspects that are now I have to do, right? Or my one of my co-founders has to do, right? And we have to do like, and there's like things that to be perfect as an engineer, you sort of like you're dismissive of, but they're super important to the company, like, and I think there's this aspect of that that's, a challenging way to, you have to rewire your brain about what is a priority. Hey, this is a really cool engineering problem, but it's not a priority. We need to go focus on this. So I think that's a new thing for me that's interesting. Being able to be, more focused on customers is it's both a delight too. It's a lot of fun.
Mm.
Um, I can't, you know, overall it's been very like invigorating for me. But I spent so long at these big companies and like they I also, when I left, I just didn't feel like all the joy. Like when I started at Microsoft, it was such a fun place to work. It felt like a very small company.
Mm.
Now everyone's like it's a massive company,
Right.
but like, you know, there's this early days of the fun times. It's like it's really when you're in the early days of something and you can shape something, it's
Yeah.
it's really fun, right? And I've had that experience a couple times at Microsoft where we did specific product lines that were new and we were being innovative. But this is my first time owning the whole thing myself, and I really love the freedom. And I also think the thing that I'm really loving is getting to pick the people I work with,
Mm-hmm.
and really optimizing for having fun.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like you often don't have a choice. Like you end up working with someone who's difficult, or it's like, yeah, this is not the like, and getting to shape the corporate culture. A lot of those things are really, they're just awesome. Like this, it's so liberating. And I like remarked to myself, why didn't I do this 10 years ago? Like, why didn't I do this earlier? Like, there's been a bunch of things. The worst part is there's been a bunch of products that came out that like I had built at like Microsoft and LinkedIn that are now like big companies, and I'm like, I never thought it was a good idea. I was like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
but now I'm like realizing that the whole startup world is its own interesting space, and you learn so much that I think it, you know. And on the flip side too, the thing that I've thought of most about the last few months is that working in a big tech company right now, I just don't know. It seems like the wrong time to be in a big tech company.
Mm-hmm.
Like right now, like we're literally in the early days of the internet boom, right? At a pace that's even more accelerated than that. And the amount of change that's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years is insane. And I don't like, I don't feel like I would learn or grow as a
Mm-hmm.
person being in any one of those places. And I would reflect and I've talked to a lot of other engineers, and it's like, there's such an opportunity to shape the industry right now by being in the startup space that I just don't see how I could do anything else right now.
Yeah.
Like, and
It would
I,
be a shame to not be in the center of it.
yeah,
It doesn't happen that often. Like in my mind, it happens once every 10, 20 years, maybe, something like that.
yeah. And it's a really, and like the number of founders I talk to and friends I have, and, I'm advising a bunch of other startups, and the energy is just different. Like
Yeah.
when I talk to friends I have at big tech companies, they look like defeated. It's like they're getting beaten every week almost. There's energy that's just like and when I worked a lot of this, I was super excited. I thought all we're doing is we're changing the world, we're doing big things. It feels like the place if you want to be, if you want to change things, if you want to make an impact, you want to change people's lives right now, is to be in a startup, right? Of course, you can make a big impact at a lot of these companies as well, but I think it's just easier to touch and feel right now in the startup space, and it's so accessible. And I just remember the pull in like the late '90s of people to internet startups, and it's very similar. It's just
Mm-hmm.
very like hey, anyone can go to a company, build something, get it out the door. And honestly, I think if you're not trying it at least once, you're going to regret it, right? I think I look back at my career of many times I had to do this, And I think every time I had a chance to do something similar, I look back with regret and say, like, I should have done that. I should have picked that choice.
Hmm.
Um, and it's also just you know, being in an engineering org inside a large company also limits your like sort of view of the industry. Like you see a bunch of engineering, but you don't think about how
Right.
sales works. You don't think about GTM. You don't think about marketing. You don't think about like all these things. And I think, for me, even if I went back to a big company, I'm a much more rounded, well-rounded executive now that I would have a much better perspective on different dimensions of how the company operates from doing this. And I think to me that I it would be very hard to get some of these experiences. Plus, you know, man, I just found my love for technology again. Like I've really
Right.
like love I always loved tech and I always loved playing with things and doing different things. But man, every day I'm discovering a new tool or a new thing to use. And like it's changing how I think about the industry. It's changing how I think about tech. And I mean, that's why I started working in this industry. Is I love technology. I
Hmm.
loved working on kernels and low level file system stuff. I loved it. I was super passionate. And I feel like I did then. I feel
Hmm.
like I'm like sort of at the beginning of my career sitting in the bookstore with all these computer books with so much knowledge that I could never learn in one lifetime and just being excited about every day learning something new. And to me, that's amazing. That's an amazing feeling to have after having such a long career, right? To be able to feel like there's so much more to learn, there's so much more to do. Um, and I would hope for everyone is to feel like that excitement, that energy, that
Hmm.
passion to like I can do something that's going to transform people.
I think that this might be for our listeners or viewers who are, working for a long time in a big organization. This might be one of the best, if not the best, recommendation to try out the startup world.
And honestly, I think the key thing for people to keep in mind is it's not a risk. Those big companies are going to be there.
Right.
When you take a year or two, you go do something, you'll become more marketable. You become more interesting after you have that experience, and you'll get to learn a bunch of things that you maybe, like I just talked to someone who's like, I don't know anything about any of this stuff. I've only worked on this technology. It's like, that's the beauty. You get to learn a lot of
Hmm.
things you would never get a chance to touch. So yeah, I
Right.
really hope it's been fun.
All right. So I think it's time to wrap up the conversation, Jared. It was really insightful. It was one of the best conversations that I recently have, and and I learned and I wrote down so many things, and I have so many new insights. So I'm hoping that our viewers slash listeners will find it at least equally insightful as I did. Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
That wraps part two of my conversation with Jared Green. A conversation about 80% rule, the maintenance gap nobody is building for, and why modality of AI might matter more than the model itself. And last but not least, a pretty strong case why right now might be the worst possible time to stay at the big tech. Thanks for listening, and see you in the next time.